Welcome to our challenge on focused notes. As you know, focused notes is one of our key AVID strategies, but it's also going to help us hit UDL checkpoints 3.2 and 3.4. And our I can statement for today is that I can implement focused notes in my classroom to deepen my students' transfer of knowledge and to highlight big ideas. Again, that's checkpoints 3.4 and 3.2. So looking ahead, so by the end of this challenge, you're going to be asked to apply your learning by creating lesson materials that will guide your students through all 5 steps of the focused note-taking process. You're also going to be asked to reflect on what strategies you use to teach your students these steps. So as we go through this presentation, just keep this in mind that you are going to be asked to create evidence showing that you have had your students do all 5 of these steps, and you'll also be asked to show us how you taught the students those steps. So if you haven't already, please go ahead and open up the Focused Notes on Focused Notes Note Taker, which is linked in Schoology where you accessed this presentation. It is up to you whether you complete those notes electronically within Google Docs or whether you print them out and complete them as a hard copy. If you do them as a hard copy, because this is tied to EPER, I simply ask that you bring them to my office when you are finished with them. And if I'm not there, you're welcome to just slide them under my door. When you open up that note taker, you're going to see a familiar 2-column note taker. But I do want to draw your attention to how we're using the left-hand column for this. In the left-hand column, I'm asking you to draw some similarities between how you currently have students taking notes and this focused note-taking process, or how things differ from how you currently have your students taking notes. And we're going to touch upon using this column when we get to part 3, step 3 of the note-taking process. So don't worry about it just yet. We're going to have designated time for taking our notes here. Again, this is going to be step 3 where we're making connections. But that's why we're using this format is it's going to allow us to kind of plan ahead when it comes to you creating your lesson materials. It's going to help you reflect on what you're currently doing so you know what you want your students to do in the future. So that's why we're using that format. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to move through some information on the focused note-taking process, and what I ask you to do right now is take notes on this presentation using the right-hand column of that note taker, and that's going to give you practice with step 1, which is taking the notes. And then as we move along, you'll have an opportunity to practice with steps 2, 3, 4, and 5. The focused note-taking process is a 5-step process. First, you have students take the notes, then you have them process the notes, then you have them do some connections in their thinking, you have them summarize and reflect on their learning, and then you have them apply their learning. Now, while applying the learning is the last step, I'm actually going to talk about it first because the application of the learning should be your whole purpose for taking the notes. So the students should know why they're taking these notes and how they're going to use the notes afterwards. And that should guide and inform you when you're planning out the notes, when you're planning out the presentation, when you're planning out the note taker that you're going to use. You need to know what this last step is before we can do any of the other steps. So for you as the teacher, step 5 needs to be your big area of emphasis. The way that we are asking students to apply their learning should be at least at the processing, if not the apply level of COSTAS. So we want our students maybe comparing, maybe distinguishing, maybe analyzing, or we might want students speculating or imagining or evaluating. These are all the higher level tasks that we want our students doing. So here are some examples of how you can ask students to apply their learning. Maybe you have them use their notes to participate in a Socratic seminar. Maybe you ask students to use their notes to create a research presentation. Maybe they have to use their notes to bake a recipe with accurate measurements. Maybe they have to use their notes to participate in a lab. Do they have to use their notes to solve a problem? Do they have to use their notes to create a budget? Do they have to use their notes to write a code that demonstrates a particular command in a game? Do they need to use their notes to create a PSA about some sort of problem that preteens experience? Maybe they have to use their notes to write a line of music that demonstrates a particular style. Notice here, every single item is high level, and every single item is requiring students to use their notes. That is the key, that they have to return to the notes to apply their learning to some meaningful task. We talked about where we want the students to go. Let's talk about how to get them there. The first step is obviously to take the notes. So when you're planning for this, you're going to want to select a note-taking format that is going to align well with how the students are going to have to apply their learning. You're going to be transparent with the format and the purpose. If we think back to the beginning of this video, I was very transparent with all of you as to why we're using the 2-column notes and why I changed that left-hand column for us to focus on reflecting on our current teaching practices. And I explained that using that format is going to help guide our purpose, which is to create new materials that you can use to teach focused note-taking to your students. So that's always a great way to start the note-taking process. The last thing to mention here on step 1 is that you're going to have to model how to take these notes. Note-taking, like any other skill, requires practice. So especially when you're getting started, you're going to have to model how to take good notes. And that's going to apply to all steps in the process as well. So let's talk for a moment now about selecting a note-taking format. Now, I chose 2-column notes as my format. And I think most often when we think about focus notes, we think about 2-column notes. But you're not beholden to any particular format. And 2-column notes aren't necessarily always going to be the best format. So I urge you to think about maybe how you might use a Frayer model. In the new ELA curriculum, ARC, they love these graphic organizers that they call RQs, and we can easily convert those into focus notes by adding in the additional steps for students to do once they've taken the notes on the initial graphic organizer. Okay, so that is step 1, having students take the notes in a format that is going to align to your purpose. Our next step, processing the notes, is going to ask students to start thinking about the notes more deeply. And that's going to involve some revision that could involve students doing some underlining, some highlighting, circling, chunking, questioning, adding, and deleting from what they originally wrote. And they're doing all of these with the purpose of identifying key vocabulary, important dates, classifying the main ideas and the details, and then sorting and organizing out that information. They'll also be evaluating the importance of the info and ideas. So if you're taking notes on paper, Avid has an awesome guide that you can share with your students that shows them how to do each of those revision steps when they're processing their notes. More and more, we're often taking notes digitally. So this checklist doesn't really accomplish that for us. Always give directions like what we saw a few slides ago, where you might ask students to highlight important terms in a certain color, highlight important ideas in green, and then using the comment feature to connect your thinking. We normally use that left-hand column to connect our thinking, but the comment feature in Google Docs could accomplish that really well as well. So speaking of connecting your thinking, in this step 3, students are going to identify any gaps or points of confusion that they have in their notes. So they're going to look back and go, ooh, this didn't really make sense, and they're going to start to figure out where those areas were where they got confused. They're also going to start building some connections to their previous knowledge or things that they know about other topics. And we know that connection building is going to really deepen their understanding of the topic and really allow them to retain the information more long term. Then step 4, it's pretty straightforward. Summarizing and reflecting on learning. They are now thinking about the notes as a whole and condensing it down into one small product. So they're going to pull those important aspects from the notes together to craft a brief summary. And I've seen teachers really force their students to be creative and critical in their thinking by asking them to do like a 7-word summary or something extra short. That works here as well. Which brings us back to where I started us, which is applying the learning, using the notes, which should have been the purpose for taking the notes, should have guided and informed the note-taking, and should have been at the processing or apply level of cosmos. So that brings us to a close on you being the student practicing step 1 of the focused note-taking process. And now we're ready to move on to step 2, where you process the notes. So if you did your notes digitally, your processing might look something like mine, where I'm going through and I'm highlighting key terms. So here I've chosen to highlight notes, since that is the topic of everything that I've written down. I've also highlighted process and connect, since those are the terms for those steps. These aren't the only things that I would highlight on the given slide, but those are just some things to get you thinking. If you did your notes on paper, you can use this Cornell note-taking revision to guide your revisions. So at this time, please pause the video to complete your step 2, processing the notes, and then I will be here waiting for you for step 3 when you are finished. All right, so that's the end of step 2, processing the notes. Now let's move on to step 3, connecting the thinking. And as a reminder, this is where you're identifying your gaps or points of confusion, and this is where you're connecting your learning to what you already know. So we're using the left-hand column here to connect the notes that you just took to your current practice in the classroom. How is this similar to what you're already doing? How is this different, etc.? So if you are doing digital notes, I would definitely suggest switching over to a fun color that's going to stand out. So I used, as an example, I wrote in my left-hand column that I often struggle to implement step 3. And then later on, when I started taking notes on the apply step, I wrote down that this is similar to what I do in my classroom, because I always start class with setting a purpose and explaining what my students will be doing at the end of class. So with these examples in mind, go ahead and pause the video so that you can make your connections in the left-hand column. We'll pick back up with step 4 when you're back. All right, so you've hit the end of step 3. Now we're moving on to step 4, which is summarizing and reflecting on the learning. So again, this is where you're pulling together all of the notes that you took and condensing it down into just the most important aspects. I am not going to show an example for this one, but I would say aim to have about 3 to 4 sentences in your summary. All right, we're at the end of step 4, and we're also at the end of this video. You're now going to go into the focused notes evidence assignment in Schoology to complete step 5, which is the application step.